Chelsea versus Manchester United. Let's get into the review. I'll flash these stats up on screen now. Overall, Chelsea did have the better of this game. They were more in control in terms of possession. They managed to force Manchester United back quite a bit and control the game in phases. Had the better territory, and that is again because of that same ability to force them back and essentially control the game. Where this game went wrong, it was a moment. It was the moments of quality that just really sort of surpassed Chelsea. I'm going to try flash up some images as we use the tactics board today, in between little bits, just to describe exactly what we saw. Because I think in the first half, especially, this was the setup we saw with Lavia Caicedo in the middle, Gusto again coming into this sort of right pocket, which was becoming where Chelsea could get quite a lot of space. But it was just those moments of quality from Gusto just wasn't up to par. Palm wasn't at his best when he was getting on the ball in those areas either. Um, I don't think Chelsea used the width anywhere near enough. And we're going to speak about why in that. The pivot was good. I think Caicedo and Lavia were both good. Lavia had a few sort of iffy moments on the ball, but again, he's brilliant at sort of almost bringing the pressure towards him and then using that pressure, soaking it up, and then being able to turn the ball over and sort of attack this space here. But I think what Chelsea did do fairly well, and what they knew the game plan was, and again, if you go watch the video before this, the preview for this video, we spoke about these pockets and how essentially Palmer and Gusto could affect the game without touching the ball. And I think we did see that in terms of splitting this pivot, if we change that to like a yellow or something, quite far apart to allow Jackson to drop into this space. Again, I'll try and put up a few images of that now. And I think that these passing lanes were opened up fairly well by the movement of Gusto and Palmer. So that part of the game plan makes a lot of sense, and I think Chelsea were looking to make this a slower game, force United into this sort of four wide two with the pivot, and then four again along the back. And Chelsea were able to make United sort of sit into this shape fairly easily and control the sort of tempo of the game with this 5 versus 4 here for Manchester United, for Chelsea against Manchester United. What didn't work as well is when Jackson did receive the ball in here, there was a few times where a defender followed him and he either sort of there was a few times where he was sort of taken out and they weren't given as a foul, which is sort of hearsay. I think a few of them were a foul. Some of them maybe just on the edge of one. It's tough to say, but he was receiving in those areas exactly as planned with the idea of spinning off, but it just wasn't quite coming off. But the idea was there and he was getting into the areas in which to do so, at least in the first half. In the second half, it didn't feel as that, but we'll speak about the second half in isolation. What I think Chelsea didn't do enough of, and I think where the issue was in this game for me, was instead of keeping these players pinned out of the way and sort of dragging them inside to open up lanes and dragging them outside to open up lanes, what we actually saw was Palmer dropping into this sort of gap here to receive the ball, which is fine because we've seen that a lot this season. But what was then happening was Agate, or I think whoever it was Casemiro in this one, didn't have to follow because he could almost pass this on to that passing lane here. In which case he could stay free. Jackson would sort of come into here, and then again you would almost become man marked in this sense. Now this would mean if Palmer got the ball on the outside, he has a bit of space to manoeuvre. But because of this sort of 6-man coverage of Man United, because they weren't as sort of high pressing, Palmer dropping into this pocket left him with basically a 4v6 for Chelsea. If you look at the 6 United red dots and the 4 Chelsea attackers with Gusto advanced. And even if Chelsea were then able to get Palmer into this area and he'd sort of find this ball into Gusto, even then Chelsea were finding themselves they weren't able to get the extra man in attack. And I don't think it was quite working the same way they'd like. And when that happens, you need to find a different way of attacking and a different way of finding the sort of solutions you want to, right? Because you know that in this instance, they're looking to keep this double man coverage in front of the defence, and they're looking to not go too far out of that zone to take away from that, right? So what do I think Chelsea should have done, and what do I think could have been a tweak that Maresca should have made, is more usage of, if Palmer is going to drop off into this sort of gap where he's got double coverage from the DM and of course the winger who's trying to sort of block that passing lane, is to play really close in the cover shadow of this winger, to almost drag the winger inward towards Palmer so that he's fully passed him on from here. So that, like we said in the preview, this ball can go on the outside, or if even more so, Palmer's essentially body blocking here, and he's essentially on the ball side of the Manchester United winger. Then that ball can surpass both of them, miss Palmer out completely, and get into Neto, who can run 1v1 at the wing back. And again, this should have happened on both sides far more than it did, because as I pointed out in the preview, Chelsea had a massive athletic advantage in those wide areas against Neto and Madueke versus Dalot and Mazraoui. It should have been highlighted far more, and the few times they did actually manage to get at them and create some chances. But it happened too few and far between for me, and I think that was more so to do with the fact that, like I say, Palmer was more intrigued on coming and getting on the ball rather than sort of playing that role where he can almost block players out with his movement. Same as Gusto could do it on the other side as well. And I don't think Chelsea used that enough, especially when they realised that these players weren't going to drag all the way out with these two to leave huge spaces in the middle. They were being a little bit more cautious in terms of they would sort of move over a little bit and then they'd sort of stay in this zone here to make sure that they could get back across into the middle. They weren't being fully dragged out man for man, sort of like Curtis Jones was against Liverpool with Palmer, in which case that makes a little bit more sense as to why you wouldn't funnel it down the wings. So that was the first half. In the second half, we of course saw Gusto taken off, which I did agree with, because I don't think I like him, and we're going to do a video about him on Wednesday with him, Cucurella, Reece James, and talk about the fullback issue in more detail, because I think that what people fail to understand with this whole sort of fullback sort of positioning is how they platform other players, and that is their role. Their role in the team is to allow other players to play in their best positions and to get the best out of others. So we're going to do a video all about that, because I like Gusto in that number 8 position. Let's put it that way. I think it's a good fix. I think it gets a lot of the best out of other players, and I think it gets a lot of good things out of Gusto. But I just think his quality on the day wasn't great. So yes, in that sense, I agree. This change makes sense, okay? But to do this, we then saw a bit of a switch in the back three. Again, Cole coming out here, Fofana and James. The first switch that I don't like is these two. I prefer Cole in the middle. I've said it the whole time. I don't think Fofana is as good in the middle of the pitch. I prefer him on the outside of the block so he can carry forwards and sort of make those inward passes. I don't really like him trying to play passes through the lines as much. Not that he doesn't completely have it at all in his tool set, but not the biggest fan of it. Prefer Colwell in there, and I think at that point we did just start to find our way through the lines far less, especially from central areas, because of, again, you've lost that little bit with Colwell being out wide instead of in the middle. Cucurella, again, he's just not as good in that zone of the pitch either, like to actually receive in the pockets. I don't mind his positioning, and I think he's a nuisance in the counter press when he's in these areas, which is why I don't mind it for certain games, because I do think that when Chelsea lose the ball, he can be very aggressive in these areas of the pitch, especially in this sort of left half space / left wing box, and he can win the ball back very effectively. So I don't mind it for that reason. But overall, I think Chelsea just struggled in this game, and even with Cucurella coming in, we wasn't able to sort of draw them inward and find that ball out wide. It still didn't happen enough in the second half. There was a few chances made in the second half, but it wasn't from that. Jackson, far too uninvolved, especially in that second half. Like I said, he wasn't even really receiving in this area of the pitch, dragging players with him. The wingers just nowhere near enough. Even when you had Mudryk come on at one point, that was for Madueke. Neto went over to the other side. Who was the other change? And my recording just cut out on me as I remembered it was Enzo Fernandez, the other sub, for Romeo Lavia. But that is going to be it for today's video. Let me know what you thought of the game. and come back for tomorrow's Tactics Talk stream where we talk about Caicedo, Fofana, his importance out of possession, and much, much more.